This evening.
Anywhere.
Good evening. This evening, if you have a question that you are not comfortable asking out into the group, you may send it to Gail or I privately, and we'll be happy to share that question out. We've asked the folks as they've come into the room this evening, if you think your library has a personnel policy, there's no shame if you don't. Tonight's work is to get you started on that process. So we're happy that you're here this evening, and our small group should allow us the opportunity to actually answer your questions and help you get started on the right foot.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and open up the slideshow. There we go. Okay. I really want to welcome you to this third and final CKLS trustee training for 2022. This has been a series kind of about library policies. And when we were in Mankato Live in July, we talked about all the different kinds of policies your library should have to help you as trustees govern the library and to help you as librarians to run the library. If you missed that, we still have all of the key documents so you could kind of recreate that for yourself. Policies are very important, and that's why we're going to spend some time and talk about them today. In particular, we're going to talk about personnel policies. Okay, should be able to do, there it is. There's my button. Okay. Can you see that big bar right across the top? That must be me. Okay, I can. The library board has a special role in policy management. And that's because the board and the director both have very unique roles and responsibilities. It is the library board who hires and perhaps fires the library director. When you're hiring a library director, it's not enough to be technically proficient. The librarian is the face of the system. And so the board needs to be pretty particular and hire a competent, dynamic, and very enthusiastic director. From there, the director then runs the day-to-day running of the library, and the director hires and fires any other library personnel. That would include volunteers. The library board as a whole is the director's boss. Patty, can you explain that to us, please?
So no one member of the board is the direct boss of the director. The library board as a whole works as a corporate body to instruct and guide the director's work. And so therefore the work that the board assigns to the director should happen at an actual board meeting. The goals should be outlined and the actual work should be outlined with the entire group together. Any one person stepping out of that corporate body giving those directives is not following the idea of corporate body and can put themselves in a very delicate situation and also put the library as a whole in a difficult situation when one person steps away from that corporate body idea.
Thank you. It can also be difficult for the librarian if she has 3 or 4 different people telling her to do different things, reprimanding one another. The librarian doesn't know where to go, and she can't be, or he can't be, a success at all. So the library board is the only body at the library who can approve the policies, including a personnel policy. The best policies are always written with the library director and the board working together. The director is going to have some information that the board is not going to have, and that's going to make a difference in a good policy. The library board approves the policies, including a personnel policy. The library board sets salaries and benefits. Now, if you're in a large library and you have a lot of different employees, or even 3 different employees, the library director surely at the beginning of the budget process can go to the board and make a proposal about why certain individuals, about why all library staff needs to receive an increase in salary or a change or increase in benefits. And the board should welcome that input because, again, the librarian has special information. Now, the library board evaluates the director. That should be done annually. But then the director will evaluate any other library staff. That is not the job of the library board. And I think you'll find there we go. If the library board is doing their job, they don't have time to do the work of the librarian. And the reason that I started out with this is because I frequently do what we call a policy edit. So if you have a policy or a personnel policy, you can send it to me and I'll go over it. I'll make notes and I'll make sure that it's up to date for you. Often in personnel policy, I see the board doing the hiring of all employees. They evaluate all the employees. If the board's doing that, they don't have the time to do what their own work is. Personnel policies define how employees are treated, their rights and obligations, and how they relate to each other and to the board. They are essentially the blueprints that run the library. Most libraries on tonight have 1 or 2 employees, maybe 3. And a lot of libraries that size think that they don't need a personnel policy. If you have even 1 employee, I believe that you need a personnel policy because otherwise, how are they going to know how to behave? How will the board know to interact with staff? Personnel policies contain instructions and rules for dealing with issues. Someone shows up late every day, or overcoming obstacles that can present themselves during the normal working days and under extraordinary circumstances. It's a valuable communication tool. I've worked with library boards before who didn't tell their library director how they needed to be informed if the director wasn't going to be there to open the library. And so the board wanted to take action and let the library go. But when I visited with them, they realized that they had skipped a very important first step. They hadn't communicated that to the librarian. How could the librarian know what the board wanted to do because it wasn't a policy? The personnel policy is well written and it will help the library follow all state and federal rules and guidelines. And again, if you've got any questions, you can just ask at any time or type it into the chat. If you type it into me, I'm not going to see it right now, though. Okay.
Sorry, I'm taking her off of this.
That's okay. Patty, can you read the title? I can't see it on my screen. In the white box?
Yes, why a personnel policy is where you're at.
Okay, good. We talked about the library board as a corporate body. And so that means that the whole board is the boss of the librarian. The whole board needs to know the rules, and that way you don't get 3 or 4 different people telling the librarian what to do and contradicting one another. Also, employees need to know the rules, even if there is just 1 employee. They need to know what their expectations are. As library board members, you owe it to your employees to maintain reasonable consistency. And honestly, it is much easier to take negative employment action. That's a fancy way to say fire someone. If the personnel policy is written, if it's reasonable, if every employee has a copy and everyone consistently follows the rules.
This is Patty. I've been on both sides of this this action before, and yes, it is difficult. But as an employee, if I didn't have those documents, I would not be able to fully meet the commitments of my job, but also understand what my expectations were. And so the policy is far more important than a piece of paper saying, make sure you're to work on time and this is how many vacation days you get. It's being able to, it gives me the confidence in how the process would be handled if in fact I were to do something wrong, or if I were to see my director do something wrong.
Yes, it goes up and down. So there are expectations with a personnel policy. Expectations for the employer and for the employee. Employers want their workers to show up on time. They want them to show up when they're scheduled to work. They need to know that when their employees are off, they're off. What are the job requirements? I was told there'd be no math, and that wasn't true. But when I looked through my employee handbook, it said, yes, indeed, I would have to do math. Are there expectations about email? Is this a work email only? And is there a drug policy? Now, employees have absolute expectations. We want to know when and how much we'll be getting paid, what that amount will be. Do we have any violence? What happens if there's sexual harassment? And that can be from someone within the organization or from someone without the organization. What are my expectations of privacy? If your library has a security camera, that must be addressed in your personnel policy. Equal opportunity employment and any grievance procedure needs to be in that policy. Administrative issues can include disclaimers or changes to the handbook or other policies. And I figured out how to move that bar. Okay. So Patty, will you talk about procedure versus policy? And I've thrown a new one at you here. We've got procedural policy.
Okay, so generally, when we write library policy, we do not include procedure as part of it. However, there are two cases where you almost always have to have procedure included into policy. So policy is the what we do, procedure is the how we do it. And so in the case of a personnel policy and also a disaster or library safety policy, that might be the other case we might put procedures in. Now, in normal cases, when you're using the procedural part of a policy, say circulation policy, staff members may have some wiggle room on how those procedures are done. That is a little more cut and dried in a personnel policy because the procedures are the guidelines that a staff member or even a director should follow to be able to complete their job correctly.
Yes, a great example of that is the dress code. Most libraries will say no shorts, or you can't show your back and your shoulders, things like that in a dress code. But what if the librarian's duty that day is at the city pool and they're supposed to be swimming? Because it's the end of summer library program, we're celebrating. So those are the kinds of things that you need to be careful about in that procedural policy. That's one of the reasons that we're glad to do a policy audit for you. Does anybody have any questions about this part? It's kind of tricky.
I do have a question in the chat. You've mentioned job duties a couple of times. I think it's important to distinguish between what is in the policy and what is in an employee job description.
Yes. Job descriptions are approved by the board, but they're not written by the board most of the time because the board often doesn't have an idea of the day-to-day work of the librarian or director or the other employees. So the duties are often laid out, for the most part, never completely, in the job description. When you're hiring a new employee, you want to make sure you have a copy of that job description for them so that they know what is expected of them as far as work. And that will be things like checks books in and out, shelves books, greets customers in a friendly manner, and things like that. In the personnel policy, the duties will look a little bit different, and we'll come back to that because I'll have an example for you. Now, where's that mouse again? There we are. Okay. These are kind of obvious, but I thought it was still important to include them. Signs it's time to review and update policies. If your policy no longer jives with what the library staff actually do, it's time to look at a review. It could be that you keep with the same policy and then the director needs to bring the staff in line. And so, for example, this could be if a person is late, but no more than 7 minutes, they can still clock themselves in on the hour. Or it could be the other way. If they're late by 7 minutes, they're not going to get paid for 15 minutes. Those are things that really need to be well laid out. Here's another thing is the board may have an expectation that employees will not use the phone to conduct personal business unless there's an emergency. But if the staff don't know that, they may get a call every day from their kids saying, okay, I made it home from school, where's my snack? And then the parent needs to discuss this with the children and it ties up the phone. The laws
So
have
Gail,
changed.
to
Yes.
interrupt, talking about things that don't necessarily happen. The phone is a good example because of this invention. Because
That's right.
what does the employee policy say regarding cell phone use? Because
While
if
at
you say
work.
if you can't use the phone, the kids can't call me, can I answer this one? And so
Right.
you can see how in that first line policy doesn't necessarily agree, because the policy may actually be written to match a landline phone, but this is how the world
Mhm.
communicates now.
Right, right. Yeah, and some people aren't good at controlling their own behavior on the phone. And that expectation definitely needs to be laid out. Laws have changed or times have changed. So one of the things with laws that have changed is for right now, the federal mileage rate changed. I think it's now at 62 cents a mile. If in your personnel policy, you have the federal mileage rate from 2007, where it was much lower, that needs to be updated. Much better just to say employees will be paid at the federal mileage rate when they're going to continuing education. It's been more than 6 years since the last review. It is recommended that policies are reviewed annually. This should be right on the board's schedule. It should be something they do for several months each year. But it would take more time than the board has during their meetings over the course of 1 year to review all of the policies if you have the ones you need. And so our recommendation is always to review 1/3 of the policies each year. And that would include the personnel policy. Another good reason it's time to review and update is your library staff doesn't know what the current policy states. If you've got procedures mixed into policies, that can happen. Now, there are, as Patty said, certain circumstances, a disaster plan, a library challenge is when you'd have a procedure mixed in, but not with the personnel policy. And the current policy just doesn't work anymore. And so an example of that might be that the board needs to reevaluate when we close for snow days. There are mistakes that a board can make with the personnel policy. One of the policies I'm working on right now is obviously a big cut and paste from a policy they saw somewhere else, but it isn't from a library. It's from an industry, and it's a very different kind of work. And so, requiring the librarian to wear safety shoes and a safety helmet is something that you don't really want in there. You want to be careful when you're writing it. You don't want anything that's in violation of the current laws. You don't want anything that's over restrictive or just written to correct one employee's behavior. Remember, I used that word reasonable in the beginning. You don't need to include payroll or attendance in the personnel policy. And by that, I mean, you don't need to say that all library employees make a minimum wage as defined as, and that doesn't need to be in there. That's something different. You do need to define attendance as to what the expectations are. And you don't want anything vague or ambiguous. One of my pet peeves is when I see a board put in policy that such and such is left up to the director's discretion. Your library director's job is hard enough. When you put in policy that something is left up to their discretion, you've essentially got them out there walking a tightrope with no safety net. You should also not include interview questions in the personnel policy. That's an entirely different document.
In that line, that vagueness, or that up to the director's discretion, think of a situation where a director may be having a particular challenge with an employee. In that situation, they may not mean to, but perhaps not apply the rules fairly and equally to all employees, because Mrs. Jones has got them over a barrel today. And so we have to remember, if we take that ambiguity out of it, there's a better chance that everyone is getting the same equal and fair treatment.
And I have another example that goes along with that. In small towns, it is not uncommon that the library director might have a daughter-in-law or a sister or a son who also works for the library. It just sometimes has to happen that way because there's nobody else. If the employee or the personnel policy is not well written, it's very easy for other employees to claim that that relation might be getting preferential treatment. And that claim may be true or not true, but the rules are reasonable. And if the director then follows the rules for every employee, then we know that there's not going to be favoritism. So I put this in here because a personnel file is not the same as a personnel policy. The personnel file is a file for each employee. It's kept locked. It's not to be shared. If you get someone requesting information about an employee, almost none of this information can be shared. You can share that, yes, this is an employee and yes, they work here, or no, they don't work here anymore. They used to work here. These are documents that are specific to an individual. Any files accompanying the application, which can be copies of driver's license, copies of social security cards and things like that. That's why we keep it locked up. An offer of employment, perhaps with a specific salary written on it, W-4s, all onboarding signatures. So when we show the example policy at the end, there is a signature page. The employee would get a copy and that would go in, the signed copy would also go in the employee's file. Any sort of performance evaluations go in there, good and bad. Those could be copies again, and any notices on attendance or tardiness. Any sort of contract between the employer and exit interviews and documents pertaining to that exit interview.
Are these documents that as an employee, I can request and see.
You may request and see your own personnel file at any time. Now, when I say at any time, I put heavy quotation marks around that. If it's story time and I'm the story time leader and I have 50 kids in a very small space, and you as my part-time employee come up and demand to see your personnel file right then, I'm going to say I can't do it right now, and that's just fine. This is not for board members' information either. They should not have access to this. The library director should keep this information locked up and private. It's going to be things like reference backgrounds, drug tests, if you do that. Are they a veteran or are they not? Is their salary garnished for child support? Are there any restraining orders on that individual? Are there any grievances, complaints, or allegations against the individual? And if that's been solved or not resolved, that would also go in the personnel file. And this is a confidential file again. Okay. So I'm checking the time. We're doing great. Okay. If you've got a policy, and I'm going to show you a magic policy soon. We talked about reviewing a third of the policies every year. What are the steps for a policy review? Number one, the director provides input along with any other staff members to the board and helps make recommended policies. So what I mean by that primarily is your library director can give us a call at CKLS. We have a lot of policies on file here. We can send 2 or 3 different ones that we think will be right for that size library. Those are in a Word format. The librarian or director can present those to the board, and then someone can edit them or customize them, as I like to say, to fit your library. That's an important part of the work that we do at CKLS. It saves you an incredible amount of time. The board is going to discuss and revise and approve policies. If you're doing a third of the policies a year, down in the bottom right corner of each policy, I always like to have the approved date and the revised date or the updated date. Policies are living documents, and so you want to regularly look at them and see if they're still working. Just update them, or just putting a signature or a date on there isn't good enough. You need to take a good hard look at some of those questions we asked previously. Is this policy working? Before you put your date stamp on there. It is the director's responsibility to make sure that all library staff are aware of any library policies, to include a personnel policy, and the director should train the employees on those policies and the implementation of those policies. Employee policies can be pretty wordy, and so that may be something that your director would want to do in segments. It's something I do regularly with my library staff. We cover a bunch of policies or a part of the personnel policy every year. The board does review policies, so at least a third of the policies are reviewed every 3 years. The way that I do that as a library director is that in the spring, we have our first reading of the policy. I give every board member a new copy and print a new one out for myself. That's meeting 1. At the second meeting, we talk about the policy. The board asks any questions. We make any necessary changes. And at the third meeting, then the board approves the policy. So if we start in the spring, some of the policies we just whip right through. We know they don't need any changes, but we still put when it was last updated. Some of the other ones are a little bit longer, and that way then we've got clean, good new policies to share with those new board members who are coming on, and then that way they can get comfortable with them and ask any questions. So this has gone pretty quickly. We've got a lot of helpful websites for you here today. CKLS, of course, and we're always your first source for help, we hope. And some other things here. There is all the way down at the bottom, a pre-employment guidelines, what you're forbidden to ask in an interview. It's important that the board know that. The second, I'm working from the bottom up, that's okay. Kansas and federal labor law posters, they're required to be posted in every library. Every spring, librarians get an email from a business who makes these posters and laminates them and sends them out and sells them at great expense. You do not need to use those. You can follow the links here and it will take you right to the policies, the exact policies you need, and you can print them. They do need to be posted in the library. So you need an employee bulletin board or a binder or something like that somewhere in the library, and staff need to know where these are. SHRM is the human resource management, and there's a URL there that I used to help with this. There's a community toolbox, and the first source is why have written human resource policies. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and we can answer questions. Let me close this. Okay, there we go.
Okay, Gail.
Yes.
So I've got a couple of things for you. One, you used the word reasonable a couple of times, and someone asked, isn't reasonable a little fancy way of just being vague? What
It
would
is.
you have?
It is. However, courts have defined what reasonable is. Reasonable to me, we go back to that shorts in the swimming pool, or a good one that I would like to see a lot of libraries take a close look at before winter sets in is the emergency closing for weather. As a board, if you say we never close for weather, is that reasonable? Because we know that we can have ice storms where no one should be on the road. That's not really reasonable. If we never close for weather, then what does the librarian do when a tornado is bearing down? It would be unreasonable to say we never close for weather. Is that a vague enough example of a vague term?
I think that's a really good way of putting it, because yes, because even in this situation, library never closes for weather, but you use the example of the tornado, but what if the building is flooded? The building has to close.
Right.
Because there's no, so using a term like that, there are good examples that you can use to fit the situation.
Yes,
so,
and like I said, courts have actually defined what reasonable is. So we know what reasonable is when we hear it. It's reasonable to expect your library to be open, for the library to be clean, for library staff to smile and greet your patrons and provide good customer service. That's reasonable. It's unreasonable for your librarian to do cartwheels every time someone comes in. That's not really reasonable, and that's a goofy example, but there we go. That's me.
So I've got a head scratcher for you. This one's going to make you think. But
Why, thank you.
But this is something that you and I have had extensive conversations about.
That probably means we've never come to a good answer.
I believe that this is the answer we're going to come to. So I have a question. Okay. How do you handle employees that don't see eye to eye on topics like religion or sexuality? How do you suggest navigating this as a preventive measure from actually being addressed between the two groups? And they go on to say that this is from a general question world, not necessarily a library question world.
Okay. So the skinny is that there are federal labor laws that include anti-harassment laws that cover these sorts of things. In your interview, these are questions that you can't ask. So how do you find out where a person stands on this? Or how do you align new employees' behaviors to what the board's legal expectations are? And that's one of the most important reasons why you have a personnel policy. In a personnel policy, it's going to talk about those things. Let me share with you. Let me find this thing. There it is. Okay, now I'm going to share, and I want this one. Sorry, I have to talk myself through it every single time. Okay, I spent a great deal of time this year working on a generic personnel policy that's going to suit the medium and small size libraries in the system. And the result of that is the personnel policies of the Anytown Public Library. Where you see anything in yellow, this is your opportunity as a board to take this document and customize it. Okay, but what's the very first thing right here is that it's all about equal opportunity and affirmative action. The library does not discriminate between the sexes for comparable work. Our policy is to recruit, hire, promote, and compensate without regard. 2, later on in the policy, you'll see that it used to just always be a sexual harassment section. Now it's an anti-harassment section, and it really talks about what the library's expectations are. Now I'm going to stop sharing again. Stop share. Okay, because I want to see faces. What can happen is that perhaps a board member or an employee have personal beliefs, strongly held personal beliefs. And those beliefs form our personal ethics. The library world is a profession, and as a profession, they have professional ethics. We've done a lot of ethics training, Miss Patty and I, besides just talking it out. And one of the things that I always do is I show this, boom, boom, boom. This hand is my personal ethics, and this hand is my professional ethics. And these two aren't always going to shake hands. They're not always going to agree. But to be a good library employee, you need to come to a comfort zone within yourself where you can set aside your personal ethics and support the ethics of the profession. So this might be things like carrying materials in the library that aren't really supportive of your personal beliefs. But because a library serves everyone, we do need to carry things for everyone. Every child deserves to see themselves in a book at the library.
So one of the things that we do in ethics training, but also in all of our trainings, we find real life examples are very helpful. So this is mine from real life, past job. I had a staff member who had reapplied for a position working at circulation. When she was a former employee, she held very strong opinions about the Harry Potter books. When they first came out, she made it very clear that those were not books that she agreed with, and used the words witches and warlocks, and not in the Harry Potter way, let's just say. So what I learned through a conversation before she was given an interview for this new position was that she had taken the opportunity to editorialize over the circulation desk and basically looked at a child who brought up the Harry Potter book and said, "Do you think your mom would want you reading this?" Okay, so this is her internal opinion. So when there's a lot of questions you can't ask in an interview. but there are a lot of things that you can do the first day. And we always say, in terms of ethics, you can't unknow what you know. So when this employee was given the opportunity and she was rehired, on the first day, she and I sat down and had the ethical conversation. And I explained, and this is the terms that I use. Your librarians have heard me say this. I don't necessarily vote, believe, love, or pray as you do. However, it's our job as library employees to set those things aside and be able to open up ourselves as an employee and serve everyone equally. And it's those topics, those belief, love, pray,
Vote.
and vote, are often the ones that get us that where that clash comes in, to the point where it's really hard to separate.
Yeah. If your employee policy addresses these things, it goes much easier for you. Let me go over this. Do we have any more questions before we go over the Anytown?
When we come back, before we leave, we'll want to go out to the LibGuide and show them where they'll find policies, because we do have that
Okay.
question. Where are we going to find that list of CKLS recommended policies?
Okay. Share screen. This one. Okay. So this is this is your new good friend. If you don't have a personnel policy, or if yours is inadequate. As I said, I worked hard on this. I've covered a lot of things. Sorry, let me get that just right. Sometimes the mouse is just trigger happy. It talks about hiring in a probationary period. At your library, do you have a probationary period? I recommend one, and it can be 3 months. Some libraries do 6 months, but that probationary period is sort of a learning period where the employees are learning more about the library. The director or the board is learning more about each other. And that's when they can determine, is this a good fit, or is this a bad fit? With a probationary period, it sets everybody up for success, because we have, at the end of this time period, a conversation to see, is this working or is this not working? We also talk about how long an employee, how much notice an employee should give before they leave. Most of the time with employees, it's a week. With a library director, it can be as much as 6 months. It just really depends on where you are and what kind of library you have. And that's why I've got that in green. That's something you're going to need to customize. We talk about nepotism. I just pulled it straight off of the internet on this one. This is especially important. This second part, it could be that employment of immediate families of board members is prohibited, but that might not be realistic in your town. If you've got a great library candidate and the board is really excited about it, but they're related to one of the board members, there's a way to work around that. That board member who is related to the new employee would recuse themselves on any voting or discussion that involved the employee to whom they're related. And employment of members, even for hourly employment, I think it might be a good idea to have the board approve that, because then it's not just the director's decision if they're hiring their own family. We all now must comply with immigration laws. I can't rattle them off the top of my head, but I sure know where to go and find them. And this section here really talks about that. Here's where we talk about disability accommodation and where we won't discriminate against employees because they have disabilities. Now, realistically, there are going to be some people who physically are not going, or mentally are not going to be able to do the job, but the board needs to be prepared to make accommodations. I actually have an accommodation. I get really tired at the end of a long meeting, and sometimes I need somebody to drive me home at night. That's a reasonable accommodation. Library hours are set by the library board. This goes into policy. That means that then if there's a new director and they have a second job, which is very common in our smaller libraries, the library director can't change the hours. They would bring that concern to the board, and the board then would change the hours. And then it's the library director's responsibility to schedule the library employees so that the library is staffed. We talk about emergency closings. I've had gas leaks, bomb threats, anthrax threats, all kinds of things, and weather. Instead of saying it is up to the discretion of the library director, here's the way to say that. The library director may delay opening and or close early based on safety concerns. That's the right way to say it, because then no one can come back from your community and say, they just closed because they thought the tornado was getting close, and I don't think they should close. That individual could come to a board meeting and cause a
And
fluff.
A line in there that some library boards would be more comfortable adding to is the library director may delay opening or closing due to safety concerns. And then the procedural part is the library director should or will notify the board chair and one additional board member. Basically, that's
As
the library
soon as
director's
possible.
safety net.
Yes, it is.
And we want to point out that the term library director in here is a universal term. Librarian, librarian in charge, sometimes
Head librarian.
director, head librarian. That person is all the same person. Gail's job at Great Bend Public Library, she is the library director. She is the lead librarian. Pam Atterbury at Claflin is the library director, although she may or may not have staff at any given point. She's still the library director. And so librarian is often used as a
title.
As an exchange.
This second paragraph here is about in extreme cases, and the second sentence is important. Many of the libraries in CKLS will close if the school district closes for weather. Their boards have determined that if it's not safe for students to be out on the roads, it's certainly not safe for their library employees to be out on the roads. Others have come to that way of thinking when the librarian has made her way to the library somehow safely, but no one comes in because most of the patrons are elderly and are not going to leave in the weather. We shouldn't ask our library director to do anything that we're not comfortable doing, and icy weather is one of those things.
As a kid who's always lived in Kansas, this connection to the school district is pretty common in public libraries. And a lot of it is because school districts are very open about how they come to that decision. You know, in a lot of districts, there are 3 named people who drive in 3 different directions out on the county roads, and they make that determination through cell phone, but it used to be through phone calls or CB radios to make that determination of what the roads in the county are. Because for the exception of our 5 largest cities in CKLS, they're all busing kids in. And I see that, you know, we have Otis with us tonight. You know, those kids are coming from 3 towns away just to get to Otis to go to school. And so that's one of those things we're relying on the expert at the school district who has a procedure in place that is reliable for us to help make this policy decision.
Exactly right. And some of us don't have library directors who live in the same town where they work. That needs to be something to consider as well. Under emergency closing, what you may also want to include is, does your librarian notify the news in the media? Does she put it up on Facebook? Those are important things that you'll want to include, because without including those, Any expectation you have is going to be unreasonable because they wouldn't have known how you wanted them to act. Well, and look at right here. Posted on social media and on the library's entrance if possible. We also talk about pay during an emergency closing. We talk about reporting an absence. In many libraries with one person, if the library director can't be there, the library is going to be closed, especially if the library doesn't live in the town. They may be required to call the library board chair who lives in the town and who can go down and put a note on the library door. That way everybody knows. Here's an important one. Being sick for more than 5 days in 2 consecutive months for whatever reason except vacation. That may be reasonable in your library, or you may have a great librarian who has a number of health issues and the board wants to work with the librarian. And so they need to reword this section on absences because it's unrealistic and unreasonable for the person they have in position at the time. Every library needs to know, do our employees get breaks? Are the breaks paid for? Do they get paid to take a meal break? This is here.
Aren't breaks required by law, Gail?
Yeah, yes. Depending on how many hours someone works, yes, they are. But it is up to the employee to take that break. A number of years ago in South Dakota, I gave a talk on self-care for librarians. And when I asked them to raise their hand, 90% of the people in the room said they never used the bathroom when they were at work in the library all day long. They couldn't leave their desk. And that's an unreasonable expectation. The librarian should be able to lock the money drawer, lock the computer, put a quick note up, and use the restroom. Now, if the board gives the employees breaks and the employee doesn't take them, the employee cannot come back at a later date and say, I need to be paid for all those breaks I didn't take. The responsibility for taking the break is on the employee. You may have employees who are full-time, part-time, or a substitute. You need to define employee status. Let your employees know when they're going to be paid. This needs to be, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Consistent and regular. Your employees should not turn in their hours and not get paid for 2 months. The reason I say that is because I've been called in to do some consulting on such a situation. It's important that you spell out very clearly overtime and compensatory time. Will you pay overtime in actual hours, or might that be paid in time off by time and a half? You must define your benefits. I actually put here under medical benefits and retirement, the library does not offer benefits. This was for a small library I had in mind writing this. If your library does offer any kind of benefits, you're going to put that in here. Over here on the right, you'll need to customize for workers' compensation employment based on your total payroll. If your employees get vacation, who do they ask permission so that they can take time off? How far in advance does that need to be? Can they take it right off the bat from their first day of employment? Do they get their whole year's worth of vacation and they can take it right then? What does sick leave look like? What about jury duty? What about a funeral? It's very important that your employees know which their paid days off are. I just listed a bunch of them here. You may be open or closed on those days. You'll customize them. Your employees should have an expectation of training and staff development And I think this is well written. I don't think there's any of the libraries on here who couldn't adopt this in whole. But the board's responsibility is care and minding of the budget. Requests to attend continuing education events need to come to the director, who brings them then to the board. The board needs to look and see how much money do we have? Are we going to be able to afford this before they okay the NACE? Because you don't want it to be the end of the year and you have to close for a few days you hadn't planned on because you spent extra money on continuing education events. It also needs to talk about travel expenses. And you'll see there's no dollar amount here. Remember, I don't like numbers and things like that, but it does talk about when a travel expense report would need to be filed. And it also talks about what happens if this is abused. Salary administration, performance evaluation. The library director should evaluate all employees at least once a year. Here we go, telephone etiquette. What are the expectations on the phone? This is also where you would also add things about cell phone expectations. Library security cameras. Remember, we talked about a reasonable expectation for employees is that they have privacy. And most important here is the rules of conduct. What do we do here? What's allowed, what's not allowed? And if an employee does get into trouble, what process will you follow for discipline, resignation, staff grievances, volunteers? Remember, we talked about access to personnel files. All of that stuff is here. Okay. Now you need to know, can you take us to look at the LibGuides? I don't know if the personnel policy is up there or not. That policy that I just went through with all of you, that's in a Word format. If your library doesn't have a policy, a personnel policy, have your librarian contact me. I'll email it to them. I will work with the board on those customizations. What I'll do first is the board will work through it, and then I'll look at it and touch it up, and then it'll be ready for the board to approve. Are you taking us on a field trip, Patty?
I'm working on it, getting us there. While
Okay.
I get there, another question came through the chat. Does CKLS have resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes. Are you still there? Or am I? Patty, you're muted. The question was, does CKLS have resources for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's a pretty broad question. Do you mean resources to share with patrons, or resources to train employees, or resources
to train employees?
Would you like to answer that, or would you like me to?
This is one of those difficult areas for us. As you can look at Gail and I, you can see 50-ish-year-old white women. This is an area that we've struggled with a lot. We've both come from very diverse training and job backgrounds. However, the times that we have approached this topic, we've always shied away because we don't want it to be the white person presenting a topic from a place of a lack of knowledge. So this is an area that is on our requirements for 2023. We have brought in some speakers through our after lunch course. which is a statewide training that is provided once a month, or excuse me, once a quarter. And we're bringing in nationwide library people through an online portal to present training on topics that fit libraries from the smallest size to the largest size, and libraries of all kinds, and library staff and trustees. And most recently, we did have a DEI presenter, but this is an area that is utmost importance to us for 2023. We did meet someone last year at ARSL that we believe will be doing an early 2023 Tuesdays with CKLS for us. And we hope that that is going to get us right on the inroads to this topic. We don't want to do it wrong. And we also don't want it to look like it's from a place of privilege. And so we hope
ignorance.
Or ignorance. And we don't, and we hope that you'll bear with us.
Yes, well done. Okay, I'm here. So I will, this one. I am at the CKLS LibGuides right here. This one is library policies. You can see across the top, there are policies on all kinds of things here. Customer rights, disaster plans. I don't think the personnel policy is up here just yet. This should love my lovely picture. All of these things here in the middle column, this is the checklist of policies that your library should have. And then your sample policies are up here. So for example, with adult and youth services, you may have policies for homebound, policy for proctoring tests, interlibrary loan, library volunteers, for circulation. These topics here for collection management, especially for evaluation and withdrawal of materials. Here, this one, you just click on it and download it. It's a Google Doc, so you'll have to come over here and download it. And then it's on, close that and come back here. You can download it and customize it and edit it and do all the kinds of things you need to do. You can get here. This is at the ckleslibguides.com/sample_policies/home. The easier way to do it. Get there. Is to come over here to ckls.org. This is our website. You'll just scroll down. All of these are our LibGuides, and here's the one for sample library policies. You'll click on it and there it is. Our time is at an end. I want to thank you for spending time with us tonight. Always remember that the intent of these trustee trainings is not to scare you or to make you run off. It's to let you know that we've got resources and we are here to help. We do recommend that every library have a personnel policy because you've all got employees. Patty, anything from you before we finish?
The last thing that I'll leave you with is Gail mentioned briefly earlier about the questions that you can ask during an interview, but also there are very few answers that you can give when someone calls for a professional reference. And basically it's you can determine or share the length of time someone was employed and that they were that they were an employee, and then you can answer the question that says, are they eligible for rehire? And basically that's the limit of what you can give. And this is an area where where I hear and see a lot of information being shared that is beyond the scope of what you can share. However, if someone asks you to be a personal reference, that opens up that world to being able to answer questions about their, not necessarily their personal life, but their personal work habits, challenges that you might have had with them, what your personal relationship is. So do keep that in mind, that interview questions are one of those that You can't look at a woman who appears to be pregnant and ask when she's due. And you can't look at somebody's skin color and ask them if they speak Spanish. And those are areas that we often, we don't mean to make a faux pas, but that's an area that we make an error in a lot. Finally,
We also do have lists of different kinds of interview questions, and we can provide those to the board, and then the board can determine what they want to ask and what they don't.
the other thing that Gail didn't go into that I'd like you to just speak to briefly is a grievance that an employee has. And I think boards need to know what their role is in a grievance situation.
Yes, so often if the director has had to reprimand or correct an employee, the employee may go to a board member as an individual and let them know, or complain, or vent, or, all different kinds of, there's 100 different verbs we could use here. Remember what we talked about with corporate body. Any one individual is not the boss of the library. It is the whole board together. If an employee, in your grievance process, it tells who talks to who, and if you're not happy there, what happens next. It's important that that's laid out. If a library employee is going to a board member and the board member is taking action without first speaking with the library director at a board meeting, they're really undermining the authority of the director. The board member may not have heard the whole story. Maybe the employee is absolutely right and the director needs to go, but that's not the right way to do it. It can be difficult in small towns because you're friends with everybody and it's hard to know when do I talk or when do I not. But having that grievance process laid out in the policy, really in the way that I look at it, is it saves everybody a lot of grief. It's very clear. If the employee addresses the issue with the director and they don't get satisfaction, then they go to a board meeting and they do it. That's just, it's that simple.
The first response, if I were a board member and this were to happen, and this also should happen in the regular chain of command, is, did you speak to the employee? Did you have a conversation? The other thing that we see sometimes with board members is the board member will go to the employee about the behavior of the director.
Yes.
And that's the other issue that you need to be wary of, because if you are going to an employee and not to the source of the problem, the library director, you're following again outside of that corporate body. You're also putting that employee's employment in grave danger, because remember, who the person that hires and fires is the library director, not a library board member. So those were a couple of things that I think are important that we remember as we go off on this journey, because this is a it's not a complicated policy. It's but it takes time to get it just right. And along with the document that Gail showed you from the Anytown Public Library, she also has a personnel policy checklist, and those documents will be uploaded along with the slides. That probably will not happen until about the 12th of August, when as Mary Beth says, you guys might get it right, but we'll just see when I get back.
We'll do our best.
We appreciate your patience, and we appreciate your time this evening. I have all of you down on the attendance sheet.
Great.
And so I will make sure that you get listed in. We did get one more last question that popped in. Does policy
go ahead.
Have anything about social media as in staff, as example, in staff, board, or employees?
It should.
I am of the mind there should be a social media policy for your building.
Yes.
And that may play into the personnel policy, but if you have a good social media policy, it should be clearly defined there who's supposed to, what's supposed to happen, and how it's supposed to happen.
I have had to let an employee go because of what they posted on social media. So yes, that should be covered in the policy. And I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for being here. Patty and I will stay on for a little bit longer, but we'll be finished now. We'll stay on longer to answer any questions you may have.